Hi, everybody. It's David again, back with the Opposite of Cheating podcast, vlog, conversation video, whatever we want to call it this week. I'm here today with the extremely well-known Thomas J. Tobin. We'll go with Tom. We're incredibly lucky to have you here, Tom. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, David. I'm very glad that you and Trisha invited me to be on the podcast vlog, whatever we're calling it this week.
Many of you may know Tom through his prolific writing, and in which case I'm sure you're very excited to hear this conversation. Those of you who haven't, I'm kind of jealous because you're going to get to hear some really interesting things for the first time. So why don't we start, Tom, by telling those who don't know you a little bit about your journey and the context where you work and your main interests within higher education.
Oh, splendid question. And even for people who do know my work a lot, this podcast episode is an opportunity for me to share some of the pieces of my work and research and experience that I don't get to talk about an awful lot. So let's dive in there. My roots are in the classroom. I started my career teaching middle school and high school students writing and literature. And then I spent more than 20 years in the face-to-face college classroom teaching undergraduate writing, literature, and even business courses. In the late 1990s, I also started working, designing, and teaching online. And I've used every learning management system since I helped a 2-year college adopt Blackboard version 1. So, yes, listeners, I am that old. Now, these days, I teach the odd undergraduate writing course or a graduate program education course here and there. I engage, though, in a ton of professional development, facilitation, and teaching. 90% of that takes place in online asynchronous environments. So my classrooms, they're almost always digital spaces. So my primary goals for any group of learners is to give them clear reasons why I'm asking them to do what I want them to do, to help them engage and practice in ways that I've designed for them.
Well, that's a great segue to the first question. You've been in the classroom for a long time. What's your first memory of encountering this idea of academic integrity, and what did it mean to you then, and how has that changed over time?
Oh, absolutely. Listeners, go back with me to 1990. Yeah, 1990, 91. I started out as an academic integrity prescriptivist. I was the hard-nosed, there is only one way, and everybody's out to game the system, and I've got to catch cheaters. I was that person when I started teaching, and it did not do me any favors. I was really strict. The K-12 training, that there was right and wrong, conformity was the goal. Any deviation, that was cheating. So uh, I'm going to use some salty language here, but this is what the student wrote. I was teaching at an undergraduate institution, working on my master's degree, and it was the first time I was in a college course. As a teaching fellow, I had to be super strict about things. And on the student ratings at the end of the semester, one student wrote in pencil, Mr. Tobin is a arrogant asshole. ASSWHOLE. And it was that moment that I thought, I think I have failed these students in two completely different ways. That I was being so hard and strict about there's the right way to do it and anything else is cheating, that I wasn't really giving my students any oxygen, any room to screw things up, to try things differently, to not understand. And I also wasn't teaching them the fundamentals of writing, grammar, spelling, and all those other things. So,
Context.
yeah, context for sure. So, over time, I came to understand that yes, some learners are out there and they're willing to find the shortest route to, yeah, I got the credential. But most of us actually want to learn. Like all listeners, all your students, the vast majority of them, if you ask them to follow along with you through something that's challenging, they're going to try it. They're going to give their best effort to it. And I also recognize that what our colleague Jeff Morrow calls cop shit, there's a wonderful essay he wrote called Against Cop Shit, was more a flex of instructors' power dynamics to control the behavior of learners rather than practices that help those learners care about and engage deeply in the learning process itself. So I've come full circle and an about face since those early days. Now I am an advocate for lowering barriers to learning, and prescriptive one and done, on time or else it's a zero kind of policies. Those are those kinds of barriers. And in fact, the National Education Association asked me to write an article about it recently. It's called Are You Guarding the Wrong Tower? And what I loved about the book that you and Trisha wrote is that you talk about how a lot of the prescriptive approach to academic integrity is guarding that tower of process rather than learning.
You know, even the IRS gives extensions. So when
Yeah.
people tell me the real world, we're preparing them for the real world, I ask them what world are they living in? I
Mhm.
mean, if I had $1 for every review I've turned in late, I could buy a sandwich, if not a moped. So, I
Oh,
mean,
and that's all of us humans. We're bad at time management. We're bad at juggling multiple tasks, regardless of whether we're students, we're instructors, you name it. So you're right on money there.
but, well, with one notable exception, which is a certain academic class who got really good at those things and wound up being successful academics. And therefore, I
Mm.
think there's a number of folks in our field who want their students to be us. And that's never going to be a recipe for happiness for either party. It just wastes your time and annoys the pig, to finish a quote. So clearly, you're thinking about academic integrity has changed over time. What are some of the things nowadays that you think about academic integrity in your work, um, especially as it relates to designing those online courses that you're talking about?
Mhm. And this is where my work kind of intersects with what you write about in The Opposite of Cheating. So, since academic integrity has always been one of my research areas, I run toward the things that scare the heck out of most instructors. I'm kind of fascinated by the prevalence of restrictions, policing behaviors, and those kinds of things among all of us as a means of controlling, surveilling, penalizing learners, and all supposedly in the name of academic honesty. Now, your book is a welcome antidote to that kind of thinking. I've been working along similar lines for a while now. My structure is a little different than the one you and Trisha put forward, and it's a little simpler. So I'd like to share a top level understanding of how I look at academic integrity. There's really only three main ways that we can ask students to demonstrate academic integrity: trust, verification, observation. That's it. And each of those three paths is best suited to specific kinds of learner activities. So the least intrusive method is trust. The instructor trusts that the students will act honestly in creating content or taking assessments or engaging in activities. And there are kind of three levels of trust from least to most interactive. So you can put an honor code and then just post that in the place where students are likely to need it, like in the instructions of an activity or something along those lines. And more interactive are things like sanction statements, which outline not only here's the behaviors that we expect of you, but here's also penalties for not doing that. Those sanction statements are also placed at the point of need. And the most interactive trust method is a signed honor code. So if a learner in an online space keys in their name as a quote unquote legal signature, it doesn't have the force of law at all. But it just says, hey, we expect you to abide by these kinds of conditions when you're engaged in this activity. And you, by putting your name here, are telling us you've agreed to do that. Strangely enough, the research shows that the signed honor code kind of thing in an online asynchronous format that actually moves the needle on academic honesty behaviors. When students are called to mind about these are the expectations, and then asked to say, I understand them and they are clear to me, the rate of dishonest conduct goes way down. I mean, this moves the needle 4 and 5%. And if you're an academic researcher out there, listeners, you know that anything over like a 0.5% is massive movement. So this is one thing that everybody could do tomorrow in your online tests and quizzes that actually has a fairly large effect and impact. So
Let me also add
yeah,
advocacy with your LMS providers. Ask them to make this an option in your LMS. I've been pushing for this for years.
the folks at Desire to Learn have heard you. That's actually in the roadmap now. Anthology and Instructure, get on board, y'all.
Well,
So yeah.
they may not be worth arguing with anymore, if you see what I'm saying.
Well, we'll see in a few months, right?
Yes.
So that's trust. And you should put trust as the most common thing that you do with your students. Because let's face it, nobody has time to be the police officer trying to make sure that you're verifying everybody and did you show your ID to the camera and all that other stuff. Trust is actually the name of the game, especially if you are designing your learning activities so that there are some low stakes or no stakes opportunities for students to practice, try things out, do some homework problems. And if you're worried that your students aren't going to do it because there's few points or no points associated with it, make them cumulative. If you have 10 sets of practice problems, ask the students to do them and do their best with them, hand them in, and then you'll give feedback on them, but you don't put a grade. You just put a plus or a minus. It was turned in or it wasn't turned in. And the trust comes in that if you do all 10 of them, you'll earn 5% of your final grade in the course. That reduces that anxiety barrier by a humongous amount. Now, we can't use trust everywhere in our online designs. So the next level up, and it's a little more intrusive, is verification. That actually checks the learner's works against some measurable criterion like an identity base, a collection of existing work, or the amount of time that you spend on the task. And these are the most common things that are out there today. So the big subscription databases like Turnitin, that's a verification method, and you have to be really suspect and careful with those quote unquote originality reports. And you and Trisha do an admirable job in the book of talking about that. And there's also just Google phishing, going into Google and saying, here's a sentence from the student's paper that doesn't sound like the student, or is at a different level from the student, or is using British spelling when the student is in North America. And you see if it returns any hits in Google or in other databases. There's also restriction, and I've never been a fan of this one. This one prevents learners from using outside resources. So, using something like the lockdown browser from Respondus to make it impossible for students in a particular browser to go out and open another internet browser or whatnot. The fact that we all have internet access on our mobile phones here, I'm listeners, I'm holding up my mobile phone, kind of moots the idea of a lockdown browser unless you have control over the other assessment conditions, like asking students to come into campus to a particular testing room on a particular
Yeah.
computer. And that kind of defeats the idea of verification itself.
I once called a lockdown browser a 3 foot high wall around your house. It only keeps out those people who for whom any barrier will keep them out.
Exactly. And I mean, you can do things like statistical verification, identity validation. Cripe, you can buy a fingerprint scanner if you're really into that kind of stuff. Regardless, though, of what kind of verification you're doing, the best practice is tell the learners ahead of time that those methods are going to be employed. For some things, that's a must, but for like the large database services like Turnitin, you could use verification methods surreptitiously. You could, just sneaky run it through and see, but that undermines confidence in you as learners and trust that you're trying to build. And many of the most common verification methods allow learners to take part in the verification. Students can submit their work to Turnitin themselves, see their originality reports, and then they can review and revise. So it becomes part of the process rather than part of the surveillance or punishment. And the last piece, you've got trust, you've got verification, and the most intrusive is observation. And this is still the gold standard, right? Being able to see the learners as they are completing the activities. Back in the face-to-face classroom, we do this all the time. We call them exams, and we stand there in front of the room and we make sure nobody has a calculator on their desk or their phones out or what have you. And we ask the students to write down what they're doing, or we get them in the learning management system and we are able to watch as they go along. Now, it minimizes the chance for academic dishonesty, but like proctored tests or face-to-face assessment, that's different than online monitoring. And here we have to take into account the fact that a lot of artificial intelligence-based tools, uh, they're not ready for prime time yet. They're not identifying people with darker skin as being human beings, or they're flagging as quote unquote suspicious behaviors natural tics that our neurodiverse students exhibit. Or for our students who have disability barriers in their environments, if you've got to get up and go to the bathroom during the test, it's going to flag that, and there's going to be a challenge there. So we have to have those human elements in the observation phase of academic integrity for sure. And when I teach those online asynchronous courses, long-term assignments, they're not suited to observations. The best practice for any observation is to be least intrusive, most flexible, and especially if we're not co-located in place. Flexibility of scheduling allows the learners to set up observations where and when they can do them. And I love having proctoring or remote proctoring agreements in place among our institutions like our colleges, universities, high schools, public libraries, so that they agree anybody who's at any of these places can go to the nearest one and have somebody watch them as they take a midterm examination or a final examination. So if it's worth lots of points and lots of credit, yeah, observation is the way to go. So
Let me go
yeah.
further and say I feel like this decoupling of test administration from the actual assessment process and the actual teaching process would be good for education across the board. Let's let professionals deal with invigilation, as they call it around the world.
Yep.
It's a skill to be able to do that. None of us particularly have it. Some of us have developed it because we need it. Let's us focus on learning and let someone else focus on security. It goes back to the trust that you're talking about. It creates a much better relationship between teaching side and learning side if we take the cop stuff out of it.
Mm-hmm. Well, absolutely. Preach.
So we've got trust, we've got after the fact verification, and then we've got in the moment observation.
Yep.
Tricia talks about not liking the term surveillance because it implies that it's secret, and I completely agree with you and her that it is surveillance until it stops being secret. But I'm a big fan. What do you think of some of the alternatives to traditional exams like, say, oral assessments or process assessments or some of those options?
Well, I'm all for it. And there's nothing wrong with traditional assessment methods either. You know that I'm an advocate for universal design for learning, or UDL, wherein we assume that people come to us with wide variability in their level of preparation, in the experience of schooling that they've had before they came to us, in their neurodiversity, in how much sleep they got last night. And so all of those temporary or more permanent kinds of characteristics determine how people show up to learning and assessment activities. We can't predict what combination of those things is going to exist at any moment in the learning activities that we provide to our students. So the best way to think is when we design our assessments, we should do so to give people at least more than one way that they can be successful at doing them, whether that's offering different formats, like if you're asking your folks in a speech class to give a talk to folks. Does that mean that they could write it up as a word process document and hand it in? No, because you want to hear them talk. But do they have to do it live in front of the class? You could have them do it live with a set of notes, or you could ask them to record it on their phones and then press play while they're standing there in front of the class and then answer questions from people afterwards. That can lower some of those anxiety barriers that we'll talk about in a couple of minutes here, I hope.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that what we always say is get back to your learning objectives. Figure out
Mhm.
what is actually part of the assignment and actually what you care about in your course, and then lean into that and then free up all the other degrees of freedom whenever possible.
Mhm.
Are there other UDL principles that you think intersect with both learning and academic integrity?
Well, if we're thinking about how to implement some of these ideas around UDL, I would want to talk with instructors about sort of four things that we can do generally, and then one part of UDL that follows from that. So there's four inclusive strategies that can lower cheating pressure: time, due dates, grades, and communications. So are you worried about students cheating when they're interacting beyond the eyes of the college or the university? Well, we've been doing that since 1997, right? And not with remote proctoring or browser lockout software or plagiarism scanning software. There's only one thing that works: lowering learner anxiety and pressure. Students are not out there cheating any more than they usually do. And we've got lots and lots of data to show this. But one thing that could increase dishonest conduct is putting learners into a bind where they get tempted. Shifting our learning environments, putting new rules or social norms, all of those other barriers that our students face. If I put it plainly, students are most tempted to act dishonestly when they feel anxiety and pressure. Most of us don't act on these temptations, and we all have our tipping points, though. Our current uncertain conditions can create both anxiety and pressure. So if you have to turn it in by Wednesday at midnight or it's a zero, you're going to find a way to turn in something. And the best thing we can all do, regardless of the subjects that we teach or what we support or design for, is offer students options, voices, and choices. So, one, lower the time pressure. Don't put time limits on your activities, including your exams. Where it's possible, allow students choices in how they show what they know, like an in class exam or an alternative version online. Also, design your empty LMS shells with samples like this. You talked about talking with your learning management system administrators to make a default there. Also, lower due date pressure. Advise that we should allow late submissions, even if you lower the grade for things like that. I don't, but you do you. And then lower grade anxiety. Spread the points out across your activities so that there's not one big thing that if they mess that up, it could wreck their entire grade. Or you can consider things like minimalist grading, that check plus, check minus, like Peter Elbow was talking about, specifications grading. Linda Nilsson is a great person to look at for that, or even ungrading, where you remove the letter and number grades. And Jesse Stommel is a light in that regard. And then the last part: time, due date, grades, communication anxiety. Explicitly tell your students that you're open to hearing about the challenges that they face, you're willing to accept late work, and give them multiple ways that they can make contact, especially when things don't go as they had planned. If you're unreachable and distant and they don't know how to get a hold of you, they're going to try whatever they can to be successful. So whatever you're willing to do, say it so that students don't feel that they have no choice but to quote unquote make the grade. That's a powerful template, and we can use some defaults there. And then we get into universal design for learning. And this might be a good capper for us. If we think about a diagram, and this is going to be in my forthcoming book on UDL at scale, imagine there's a horizontal box and the bottom axis is time. At the start of it, learners are beginners. In the middle, they're getting some proficiency, and toward the end, they're paraprofessional. They're becoming practitioners. We slice that horizontal box diagonally, and the bottom part that starts out with almost nothing and moves up and grows over time, that's tool use. This is using your calculators in math class, but it's also using artificial intelligence to skip steps or do the work with you or for you. And then the thing that is large and gets smaller over time is designed universal design for learning. So when learners are beginners, we probably don't want them using hardly any tools and affordances. We want them to learn the hard way, the long way, the manual way first. And with that, we want to use UDL principles of giving people lots of clear guidelines and boundaries to work within and give them choices within those structures that we create. As time goes along, though, and they get more proficient, we introduce more tools and we say, hey, let's use these artificial intelligence tools not to do the work for you, but to help you study. Make some flashcards for me. What are some study questions about this? And then we're taking away some of those guide rails of UDL, and instead we're replacing them. So imagine another triangle getting bigger and bigger on top of that rectangle, and that is agentic UDL. We start teaching our students themselves about how to create multiple
Mm.
pathways for other people to understand what they're doing. And we start giving them more authority to say what they want to learn next and how. Now, as students approach practitioner level, all the way over at the other side of the diagram, we're using lots and lots of tools. Learners are using them to skip steps so that they can focus on greater and more nuanced and more detailed kinds of engagements. And almost all of our designed guardrails and guide rails for universal design are gone. And in their place are, you tell me where you want to take this learning. What's lovely about this kind of diagram is that it's fractal. We can do that progression from beginner to proficiency to practitioner over the course of an activity, over the course of a unit, over an entire course, over an entire curriculum or credential. And we can cycle through that in a tiny way and in a large way. So it cycles within cycles within cycles. And what that does for academic integrity is it shifts the risk. It moves the risk from us as instructors and designers onto the shoulders of the students, both in a positive and a negative way. It gives them more responsibility to do well and take more responsibility for their own learning, but it also gives them more freedom to start saying, oh, this is what I'm really intrigued about, or I need to really buckle down and get the basics here because I want to take it in this other direction. So that's a wonderful way that we can use the principles of universal design for learning in order to help learners move away from just tell me the right answer into I want to explore this. And that's, you can't cheat on something that you are directing yourself. And so we want to move them from one side to the other.
There's so much food for thought there, and it's such a deep and rich way of reinterpreting a huge amount of information. And I'll simplify it because that's what I like to do, which is you're putting students learning first.
Mhm.
And the rest of everything else is focused on how do we get them to be learning. And it's a lot more technical than just that, but I think that's what a lot of us on this side of the world have in common is we're taking a learner-centered approach, which has been inspirational for me to think about things that way.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely. Our friend Nell Noddings was an educational theorist back in the 1980s and early 90s. And one of her most famous things that she's ever said was the people who are doing the actions are the people who are doing the learning. So the more that we are lecturing at students and just covering content and giving them information, that's a disservice to them. At the beginning, they need that. But as we move along, we have to recede back a little bit and make sure that there's space for our learners to actually engage in the learning process itself.
as a cognitive psychologist, it was the most liberating moment as an instructor when I realized most of my things that I tell my students are going to be out of their heads within a month, let alone a year.
Yep,
And so if I want them to have any knowledge later on, they're going to have to construct it through some sort of deep dive. And that means depth first, breadth maybe never.
excellent.
And I mean, I didn't have the benefit of a lot of wisdom at that point, but that's been borne out time and time again. So on those big philosophical notes, why don't we end with one quick tip for a lot of the folks, the busy folks out there, they want to read your book, they want to change the world, but we probably have to first get through the semester. Um, what's one thing you can suggest to instructors, either that you've mentioned before or that we haven't gotten to, that you think could really help people out with low overhead?
Oh, yeah, this is a splendid way to wrap up our conversation. So, cheating is almost always in response to perceived pressures or shortcuts. Now, there are some professional cheaters out there who are trying to game our systems in a consistent and malicious way. They are thankfully rare. Most of our learners want to learn with us, and they will follow along with what we ask them to do. So when I do find learners using artificial intelligence to write essays or answer practice problems, I try to understand why they might take the shortcut, especially if I've asked them explicitly not to do so. Those usually become conversations about time pressure, grade anxiety, mental health boundaries. Those conversations aren't about watering down the activities or giving cheating learners a pass on doing the work. I ask cheaters to sit with me in person or remotely, and we do the work together. Observation is still the best way to ensure that learners are doing the work. And, college is supposed to be hard. It's supposed to be challenging. It's where you learn things that you didn't know how to do before. But doing that with my cheaters, it allows me to be there to answer questions and help get learners back on track. So I'm not there being a cop. I'm there saying, why did you take this shortcut when I asked you not to? Let's actually now do the work together. Now, when students act dishonestly on activities, I don't lower the rigor or the challenge level of the content that I teach. I try to understand what overcame their resistance to the temptation to take the short path. And then I work with them to understand the consequences for those actions. Like in your book, assuming that students want to learn allows me to offer ways to meet their own goals without being a pushover or a strict disciplinarian. Both ends of that spectrum create problems in our classrooms and our digital spaces. So I also use universal design for learning to help show students multiple ways that they can be successful with the activities in my courses so that few students will be tempted to act dishonestly in the first place.
So much good stuff. And I will add another universal design principle that I like is that not all of our students know why they should want to learn this stuff, whatever it may be. And part of our job is to make sure that they have the context for whatever it is that we're teaching to actually care about learning, because they are not us.
Yeah, absolutely. And talking about a clear why, listeners, here's your clear why. Why would you adopt any of the academic integrity strategies that David and I have been talking about? Because it takes work off your plate. If you've got lots and lots of learners who are acting dishonestly or cheating, this is intentional effort that lowers the temperature, lowers the temptation, and creates fewer people acting dishonestly. So that's your clear why.
Same effort, more learning. Tom Tobin, thanks so much for your time today and for your wisdom. I think this has just been an incredibly interesting conversation for me. So thanks again.
Thank you for inviting me on the show, and I will look forward to connecting with the listeners down the road. Take care.